his loss, and had run back as fast as he could, looking along the line he had followed, till at last he had given it up. Seeing the carriage coming back from the station, he had let it pick him up and bring him home. This covered everything, the running and all, for his face still showed that he must have been running hard. The only question was whether he had been seen about the rectory by any but the servants for a couple of hours or so before Ellen had gone, and this he was happy to believe was not the case, for he had been out except during his few minutes' interview with the cook. His father had been out at the parish, his mother had certainly not come across him, and his brother and sister had also been out with the governess. He knew he could depend upon the cook and the other servants. The coachman would see to this. On the whole, therefore, both he and the coachman thought the story as proposed by Ernest would about meet the requirements of the case. Chapter 40. When Ernest got home and sneaked in through the back door, he heard his father's voice in its angriest tones, inquiring whether Master Ernest had already returned. He felt as Jack must have felt in the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, when from the oven in which he was hidden he heard the ogre ask his wife what young children she had got for his supper. With much courage, and, as the event proved, with not less courage than discretion, he took the bull by the horns, and announced himself at once as having just come in after having met with a terrible misfortune. Little by little he told his story, and though Theobald stormed somewhat about his incredible folly and carelessness, he got off better than he expected. Theobald and Christina had indeed at first been inclined to connect his absence from dinner with Ellen's dismissal, but on finding it clear, as Theobald said, everything was always clear with Theobald, that Ernest had not been in the house all the morning, and could therefore have known nothing about what had happened, he was acquitted on this account for once in a way, without a stain upon his character. Perhaps Theobald was in a good temper. He may have seen from the paper that morning that his stocks had been rising. It may have been this or 20 other things, but whatever it was, he did not scold so much as Ernest had expected, and seeing the boy look exhausted and believing him to be much grieved at the loss of his watch, Theobald actually prescribed a glass of wine after his dinner, which, strange to say, did not choke him, but made him see things more cheerfully than was usual with him. That night when he said his prayers he inserted a few paragraphs to the effect that he might not be discovered, and that things might go well with Ellen, but he was anxious and ill at ease. His guilty conscience pointed out to him a score of weak places in his story, through any one of which detection might even yet easily enter. Next day and for many days afterwards he fled when no man was pursuing, and trembled each time he heard his father's voice calling for him. He already had so many causes of anxiety that he could stand little more, and in spite of all his endeavors to look cheerful, even his mother could see that something was preying on his mind. Then the idea returned to her that, after all, her son might not be innocent in the Ellen matter, and this was so interesting that she felt bound to get as near the truth as she could. "Come here, my poor pale-faced, heavy-eyed boy," she said to him one day in her kindest manner. "Come and sit down by me, and we will have a little quiet confidential talk together, will we not?" The boy went mechanically to the sofa. Whenever his mother wanted what she called a confidential talk with him, she always selected the sofa as the most suitable ground on which to open her campaign. All mothers do this. The sofa is to them what the dining-room is to fathers. In the present case the sofa was particularly well adapted for a strategic purpose, being an old-fashioned one with a high back, mattress, bolsters, and cushions. Once safely penned into one of its deep corners, it was like a dentist's chair, not too easy to get out of again. Here she could get at him better to pull him about, if this should seem desirable, or if she thought fit to cry she could bury her head into the sofa cushion and abandon herself to an agony of grief which seldom failed of its effect. None of her favourite manoeuvres were so easily adopted in her usual seat, the armchair on the right-hand side of the fireplace, And so well did her son know from his mother's tone that this was going to be a sofa conversation, that he took his place like a lamb as soon as she began to speak, and before she could reach the sofa herself. "My dearest boy," began his mother, taking hold of his hand and placing it within her own, "promise me never to be afraid of either your dear papa or of me. Promise me this, my dear, as you love me, promise it to me." And she kissed him again and again, and stroked his hair, but with her other hand she still kept hold of his. She had got him, and she meant to keep him. The lad hung down his head and promised. What else could he do? "You know there is no one, dear, dear Ernest, who loves you so much as your papa and I do, no one who watches so carefully over your interests, or who is so anxious to enter into all your little joys and troubles as we are. But, my dearest boy, it grieves me to think that sometimes you have not that perfect love for and confidence in us which you ought to have. You know, my darling, that it would be as much our pleasure as our duty to watch over the development of your moral and spiritual nature. But alas, you will not let us see your moral and spiritual nature. At times we are almost inclined to doubt whether you have a moral and spiritual nature at all. Of your inner life, my dear, we know nothing beyond such scraps as we can glean in spite of you, from little things which escape you almost before you know that you have said them." The boy winced at this. It made him feel hot and uncomfortable all over. He knew well how careful he ought to be, and yet, do what he could, from time to time his forgetfulness of the part betrayed him into unreserve. His mother saw that he winced, and enjoyed the scratch she had given him. Had she felt less confident of victory, she had better have foregone the pleasure of touching as it were the eyes at the end of a snail's horns, in order to enjoy seeing the snail draw them in again. But she knew that when she had got him well down into the sofa, and held his hand, she had the enemy almost absolutely at her mercy, and could do pretty much what she liked. "Papa does not feel," she continued, "that you love him with the fullness and unreserve which would prompt you to have no concealment from him, and to tell him everything freely and fearlessly as your most loving earthly friend, next only to your heavenly Father. Perfect love, as we know, casteth out fear. Your father loves you perfectly, my darling, but he does not feel as though you loved him perfectly in return. If you fear him, it is because you do not love him as he deserves, and I know it sometimes cuts him to the very heart to think that he has earned from you a deeper and more willing sympathy than you display towards him. Oh, Ernest, Ernest, do not grieve someone who is so good and noble-hearted by conduct which I can call by no other name than ingratitude." Ernest could never stand being spoken to in this way by his mother, for he still believed that she loved him, and that he was fond of her and had a friend in her, up to a certain point. But his mother was beginning to come to the end of her tether. She had played the domestic confidence trick upon him times without number already. Over and over again she had wheedled from him all she wanted to know, and afterwards got him to the most horrible scrape by telling the whole to Theobald. Ernest had remonstrated more than once upon these occasions, and had pointed out to his mother how disastrous to him his confidences had been. But Christina had always joined issue with him, and showed him in the clearest possible manner that in each case she had been right, and that he could not reasonably complain. Generally it was her conscience that forbade her to be silent, and against this there was no appeal, for we are all bound to follow the dictates of our conscience. Ernest used to have to recite a hymn about conscience. It was to the effect that if you did not pay attention to its voice, it would soon leave off speaking. "My mamma's conscience has not left off speaking," said Ernest to one of his chums at Roughborough. "It's always jabbering." When a boy has once spoken so disrespectfully as this about his mother's conscience, it is practically all over between him and her. Ernest, through sheer force of habit, of the sofa, and of the return of the associated ideas, was still so moved by the siren's voice as to yearn to sail towards her, and fling himself into her arms, but it would not do.